Cheers everybody, John here. I'm going to do a video. I'm just kind of making this on the fly, but it's a video I wanted to do, at least the concept of a video I wanted to do for a while. So I'm probably going to show a lot of records, but I bought this record, quite a few years ago, but it's called Street Survivors, and it's on Metal Blade from 1989. It's a comp. And when I got this record, it just, it felt like, to me, the very last heavy metal record made, or like the last metal record of the era. And it's hard to explain, but like, I'm going to discuss the death of heavy metal. And like, I collect heavy metal records. Like when I initially started, I wanted to go from the first Black Sabbath record to Rain in Blood. And obviously I collect after Rain in Blood, but like that's where I think the heavy metal era was. And after Rain in Blood, it started fading out and metal started dying. It actually started dying before that, but that's really when the rot crept in. And a lot has to do with me, what was going on in my life, but I feel like the decline of heavy metal was there in the late 80s, and like we have revisionist history, like, oh, glam came in and metal was dead, or metal died because glam took over, or the hair bands got too popular and it killed heavy metal. But I don't really believe any of that, and I'm just going to give you my version of it. And being a metalhead since, I wasn't very smart metalhead, I didn't know everything, but figure since like 1980 or 81, really, like getting Back in Black and the AC/DC, and then pretty quickly digging as far as I could dig with getting records, Madam X and Wasp and Motley Crue and Maiden, Black Sabbath, like right away. So I'm kind of rambling. I don't have a plan here what I'm doing, but this record just made me kind of sad to see it. This was 89, and like I really don't know anything on here. And the only bands I knew, I remember that Little Caesar was a metal band. Like maybe I remember seeing them in like 1990, and this Black Cherry heard of, and Bang Tango. Other bands on here is like Sphinx in Cairo, Tomorrow's Child, Rain on Fire, Lunatic Fringe, Triangle Fire, NRG. I don't know any of them, but it even like has like a shot of like LA with the posters, and it looks like these chicks were, not personally, they look alright, but like the party's been going too long. This is now 89, and it's trying to carry on what it looked like in 86 or 85 with the posters, except I don't know any of the bands. And but my theory of heavy metal, and granted, I feel like the age of everyone was like, let's say, obviously this guy's older, like Scott Waters and stuff who've been into it longer, but I figure everyone like around, born in like the late 60s, like 68, 69, 70, right up to maybe the cutoff date would be about like 1974, was like the crew of metalheads. Obviously there were older guys like the Deep Purple and Ted Nugent guys who still were going to shows, and the early Priest fans, but like the guys who are now in their mid to late 40s, possibly early 50s. But we were the kids who were raised on heavy metal and were the fans. And where am I going with this? I'm just making this up. But anyway, I feel like the decline of heavy metal happened because heavy metal got stale and the bands kind of burned themselves out, and there was nothing good coming out, generally speaking. I feel like every band by 88, at least in my mind, I maybe didn't know this at the time, but every band I was kind of getting less and less interested in. Like, I was following it and going from ditching Motley Crue, moving on, like, and staying with Maiden for a bit, ditching Maiden, hitting like Metallica, then Exodus and Slayer, and obviously Venom in there, and following all these bands. Heavy metal just kept progressing, and it hit like a standstill around Rain in Blood. I think was the peak of thrash metal. And then I think the thrash metal bands started waning by 89. All my favorite bands, like I was trying to write things down, like Dark Angel, Exodus, Anthrax, Testament, Death Angel, Metallica especially, Megadeth, Overkill, Possessed, even King Diamond. I feel like they all was starting to go downhill by the late 80s. Like their peak already happened. Granted, many of these bands went on through the 90s and put out stellar classics, but at the time they were all on a downward trend, and the only notable exceptions I could think of that weren't on a downward trend in 89 or 88 was Trouble, Man of War, Slayer, and Voivod. They still had their creative peak happening. But I'm looking at bands, I was just thinking out loud, like Queensryche, Fate's Warning, Motley Crue, Rat were already done, Venom, like The Calm Before the Storm, and Possessed was already a step down, and they were done. Tigers of Pantang were completely done. Wasp were already heading down, and I'm just going to show you a whole bunch of records, and just to show you what I mean, like of bands that were in their prime, and like this Anvil record. What is this one? Pound for Pound. I mean, and I'm not trying to badmouth these records. Some of these records I'm going to show are great records. They're people's favorites, so I'm not making an opinion. Oh, this is a bad record. This is a bad record. But I just want to, I feel like this is the decline, and it had to do with more of the bands, and they all simultaneously, within like a 3-year period, all were on the decline, with few exceptions. But Anvil were virtually done. You know, after the first album, or what was it, the second album, Metal on Metal, it just kind of went downhill. And I bet you everyone starts looking, looking pretty bad too. But I'm just going to go through quick. Anthrax, and I'm not trying to push my opinion through, but at this point I thought Anthrax were clowns, you know, with the shorts and everything. You know, this isn't the heavy metal I remember. I'm not saying this is a bad record, but it's not Among the Living, it's not Fistful of Metal, or Spreading the Disease. Except we're on the downward climb after the early great records, and then Balls to the Walls classic. UFO, rock bottom. Rock bottom. This album's terrible for, you know, 70s band. They're just really lost at this point. And I saw this tour, I like this record, but this is a far cry from classic Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath were on the decline. And this one, not bad records, but, you know, Scorpions were pretty much over. They were probably over a couple of records before. But look at Girls' School. They were well done. After their first album was the best, and the second, and then they started going down, and then they get to the point that it's just, and like, I mean, this is not the Girls' School from Demolition Boys. Dio, and I'm not knocking this record, but this is not Holy Diver. And then it just started getting more off. So like every one of my bands, and this is just a great one. I'm not saying Def Leppard were ever my favorite band, but you know, Pyromania was big when I was like 13 or 12 or whatever that came out. But this is just a piece of junk. I'm not trying to challenge people like that record. I'm sorry, but I'm just showing you. You know, Saxon. People, we've discussed this. This is no Denim and Leather. And Twisted Sister, just done. Crocus, Chris showed this the other day, and I'm not saying it's a bad record, but this is not Crocus. Everyone was on the decline that I could think of. I mean, I grew up when I was a kid, one of my early favorite bands was like Van Halen, like Fair Warning Era and stuff. And then we had Skyscraper by David Lee Roth. This wasn't even as good as the first David Lee Roth solo record. Raven, one of the greatest new wave of British heavy metal bands, turned into just a joke almost. Quiet Riot were absolutely done off the map. And I'm not saying they're bad records, but this isn't condition critical, and they were just almost irrelevant at this point. Queensryche, I mean, I understand they kind of had a bit of a career, maybe even they got more popular, but as far as I'm concerned, this is not Queen of the Reich or Take Hold of the Flame. Ozzy, I think we could all agree, Ozzy was on a downward slope. Ted Nugent, classic 70s, put out this If you can't lick them, you lick them. And this is 88. Let's see what else I got. Yeah. Little Miss Dangerous. Maiden, and I'm not trying to say it's a bad record, but this is not Peace of Mind, not Killers. I felt after Power Slave, it was downhill. Somewhere in Time's not near as good as Power Slave, and I knew that at the time. I still like the album. I love the album. It's part of my youth. And this came out, and this isn't even as good as Somewhere in Time. And after this, they were pretty much done. They went into, Dickinson left, and then they started playing clubs. Sabbath were playing clubs, they're playing smaller venues, I think, in the 90s when Dio came back. I mean, here's a classic, Celtic Frost. And I love this record, but at the time, this was just a horror show. This was sad. Here's another Saxon record. I mean, I'm not saying they're bad records, but Priest just went downhill, and I knew when I had this record, and I liked it. I saw the tour was great, but I knew this was not a good record. And even if I liked Turbo, then came this with the Johnny Be Good. Oh, I mean, that's why I was more into thrash, so I wasn't paying attention to all the classic heavy metal bands getting lame. And this isn't Dressed to Kill anymore. I showed this before, this terrible Fastway record from, I don't know what year it is, 89. Stayed around at the party too long. Great band, Sabotage, and then this one, Fight for the Rock. Not a terrible record, but man, long way from Power of the Night or Sirens. And they went on to put out some really good records after this, but during those late 80s, it was the decline. Look at this. What year is this? 87. This isn't the same Alice Cooper who did Halo of Flies. It's just totally different. Blue Oyster Cult were completely done. Even one of my old favorites, Grim Reaper. It's just everyone's got the perms, and so that was I think if the bands were still putting out great records at the time, maybe I would have been interested more. And a lot of it has to do the time everyone went to college or left high school, and so I think a lot of people faded out of metal at the same time, and obviously they did because the attendance to shows and album sales went down, and people started buying other stuff. I mean, granted, there's always been troopers who carried through, God bless you, but I couldn't deal with funk metal, I couldn't deal with rap metal, I couldn't deal with the black metal, I couldn't deal with death metal after a certain point. I mean, I love death, I love, I like Creator and some of that heavy stuff, but after a while, I started burning out on it. And obviously the new metal, the 90s stuff, I had no use for that. And and then at the same time, I was into other things. I always was digging back into music history and buying into other genres. But to show more of the rock records that were coming out as metal was dying, simultaneously, and all of a sudden as I was diverging out. And I'm not saying all these records are great, but they were things that were more interesting and more vital and more fresh than Ozzy's 6th solo record, or Lock Up the Wolves by Dio, or Maiden with Blaze era Maiden. But and I'm not recommending these records or anything, but these are just White Zombie. I thought that was kind of interesting. And I'm not a fan of this band, but this was pretty interesting at the time. What is this, 87? So as metal's winding down, things are coming up. And I won't show the grunge thing too much, but I have a couple grunge records. This Alice in Chains, Guns N' Roses. I guess they took off the end, but I think after that EP with the acoustic stuff, was it Lies or whatever, the Patience one, they were completely done as far as I was concerned. But this was kind of kept metal floating for a bit. And this band, I pull out 3, but Circus Power from New York City were kind of interesting. I'm not saying they're great. I'm not saying I pull out the records, but still had metal in it, and rock, and roots rock, and a whole biker vibe. and it just was a little. It was interesting for like that 89, 91 time. Raging Slab kind of got like a southern hard rock heavy metal thing going. The Hypnotics I really liked. They were like a Stooges, British band, Stooges MC5 influenced hard rock band. Almost could hear some Aerosmith or early Seeger maybe. This is, I don't know why I pulled this, but this was kind of cool in like 89, whenever this came out. 1990, okay, 1990. This is a really good single. Like real, it's a 12-inch, kind of like a dance. I think this is like the pre-Manchester sound, but interesting. Dead Moon, more like a low-budgety band. Of course, the Cult. I mean, they were during the 80s, so they were during metal, but like this was kind of a more interesting record in the late 80s as I was getting bored with Black Sabbath and stuff. Crazy Head. Volta EP, that's a Boston band, but that was kind of like the pre-grunge, but still had metal, hard rock, and punk mixed in. Boss Hog from New York, which features John Spencer from Blues Explosion, was in Pussy Galore, but this was kind of interesting. This is 93, kind of like messed up, like, I don't know, roots rock, punk. Big Black was interesting. What is this? This is probably like 89. I don't know what year this is. Loop I liked. This might be 86, but I was liking them in like 89, and no, like the 90s. And they were like a very heavy, not psychedelic, but droney, and big heavy chords, and a little Hawkwindish maybe, but there's nothing on that record. And of course, like, Jane's Addiction was coming out, so like the alternative, not that I was into that like Chili Peppers thing. I did like Jane's Addiction for a bit when I first heard them. Green River, this is more of the grunge thing that was happening. And I'm not saying these records are all great, but Gay Bikers on Acid, that was kind of interesting. And I guess I forgot to pull it, but I'll say the Danzig record, the first Danzig record, Four Horsemen. And this was a classic. This is a great record. Mudhoney. And I mean, I was still into punk rock, and I was also digging the blues, and then that was really when I started getting into rockabilly. I mean, I always was into all this stuff, but things. This is why I got out of metal, and it's not because grunge took over or the hair metal, because I always felt there was hair metal was always happening in the mid '80s. You always had like I don't know, Dokken, and I'm not knocking these bands, but Dokken and Helix, yet I was listening to, Slayer and Megadeth. So it wasn't like, oh, those Warrants and Wingers and Poisons killed heavy metal. I just don't believe that's the case. What is this? The Faith No More. This is the single, right? The Faith No More. But those are like the records that were kind of like, I was listening as far as like hard rock and rock records of contemporary bands that was going on. But I feel the death of heavy metal had more to do with the bands weren't putting out great records. And I don't know what you think. Maybe I'd like to hear comments. And obviously people who were on, I mean, like, oh geez, Riot put out a great record in what was it, 91. There's tons of great records in the 90s, so I don't want to say metal was dead, but I meant like as far as the genre was over. And I don't know what else to say, really, but this was also inspired a little. I mean, I wanted to do this video. I was thinking about this video for, a year or whatever, or months. But his name is 6758 Passy did a video on death of heavy metal. He's talking about the death of it now, just by the age of the artists now, that most of these bands, because of Malcolm Young and stuff, that it's over. And that was a really interesting video, and I suggest that you guys check that video out, and I can't do a link, but it's 6758 Passy, P-A-S-I, and maybe a lot of you know it, but he's a good guy, and check out that video. But my just to reiterate, my feeling of heavy metal, like why I got out of it, is maybe it's not. I mean, obviously some of it maybe I got bored of it, but I felt like the music just wasn't up to the quality. It wasn't progressing in the way, besides getting faster and heavier and more deathy. You know, the progression from like 80 or 83 to 87 was amazing with records coming out. And I felt like by 86, 87, downward hill. And you just look at Metallica, you know, it was unbelievable, that Step to Master Puppets. That was an unbelievable record. And then Injustice for All, I thought at the time, and I know disagree, I'm not trying to start fights, but like I thought Injustice for All was a piece of shit, you know. I thought Megadeth went downhill, and Anthrax, and these are all my favorite bands. I thought Exodus, after Bailoff left, you know, Pleasure of the Flesh or whatever was a good record, but it wasn't as good. But that's about it. And let's see what your thoughts are. And maybe, you know, you guys got out of metal for a bit too. I don't know. We'll see what it goes. See what you think of what I've said.